Hello, hello, this is Alex Birkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. This episode is a part of our Kitchen Side series, where we pull back the curtain and show you the behind-the-scenes conversations, debates, strategies, and brainstorming sessions that we have at our agency, Omniscient Digital. Today's topic is imposter syndrome. We also brought on a special guest today, Ryan McCready, managing editor at Reforge. So imposter syndrome is talked about frequently, it's often misunderstood, and presumably it's universal. All four of us have faced it, and we cover in the conversation those experiences in detail. We also ask, is imposter syndrome useful? Is it inevitable? Does talking about imposter syndrome make it worse? And this is very important, how do great leaders build cultures of growth and discomfort and growth mindset while limiting the destructive impact of imposter syndrome in limiting beliefs? All that and more in this episode of the Long Game Podcast. All right, so I can moderate this episode.
Sweet.
I think it's at the table too. Ryan and I have more context than you, David and Allie have. So maybe we can set the table, the mise en place for this conversation. I actually didn't want to do this conversation right away. Ryan hit me up on Twitter and said imposter syndrome would be a good idea. I think it's a very popular concept. People talk about it a lot, but it's so big that I didn't know how we could wrangle it in. And after talking with Ryan, I got into the conversation and I was like, this is actually pretty interesting, especially in the context of content marketing. So I decided it would be worthwhile. And Allie, David, I know we've all talked about imposter syndrome from time to time on the kitchen sides. Mm-hmm. So I figured this would be a good place to start. And also for the audience, this is Ryan McCready. You're managing editor at Reforge, yeah?
Yeah, that's changing soon because managing an editor means nothing. And we've learned that. I'm like touching literally everything now. But
do you know what your new title is going to be, or is this
not a clue?
You can't announce anything. Okay.
Yeah, I think we rejigging literally everything because every team has a different like word that we use, and we're trying to get it all under one kind of language across the team. So.
Gotcha. Do you want to what was the impetus for you reaching out, talking about this or pitching this topic idea for the podcast?
Yeah, so I came to Reforge off of a very hot streak of building my brand and getting a lot of traffic and a lot of followers and all that stuff, and just really building it while I was at foundation. And as soon as I got to Reforge, I felt like I didn't belong because I was surrounded by all these super smart product people and these like marketing experts that built Uber, that built all these massive companies. I'm like, I am from Podunk, Bengage, where we built our SEO strategy in Google Sheets, and like I just didn't feel super in tune with all of that, and it caused me to second guess a lot of stuff, but it also caused me to like own a lot of things. And if you looked in the in the notes, I put something about like when you have such high imposter syndrome in a new role, I think you're sometimes a little more open to take on new responsibilities. And like, weirdly, that's what's helped me grow so much is like saying yes to a bunch of stuff. Because in the beginning, I didn't feel like I was doing anything impactful. And now like I said, I'm touching everything. And if I wouldn't have had that like imposter syndrome back in the day, I might've just been fine, just like hanging out and yeah.
Mm-hmm. We can go one by one on this, but I would love to define imposter syndrome because I think there's related concepts. There's limiting beliefs, insecurities, or maybe just like lack of confidence.
Yeah.
And then there's this capital I, capital S imposter syndrome. So how do you define it? Can you differentiate it from those other things? And then we can go one by one and kind of talk about how we define that term.
Yeah, that's kind of a hard question, but I'll think on it. So I would say the big capital I, capital S is just when you don't feel like you're making an impact in your current role and you feel like you question all of your decisions, even though you are technically like an expert in the field. Like you're the expert at the company, like all of the SEO stuff that I was doing in the beginning. Here, there's no SEO plan, anything. There's no one to own it here. And I still would like second guess everything. And like I said earlier, it did lead me to like double down, and like I learned so much because I felt like the skills that I had weren't above board, and it kind of made me dive into like reading a ton of Google documentation and all that stuff. So it's this weird teeter-totter of like I didn't feel like I was good enough, so I learned more, and now I'm much better.
Mm-hmm. I want to go next with the imposter syndrome. For me, it's like you're wearing a mask and you're afraid of getting found out. Like you're putting up a front, you are acting like the expert, and you're just waiting for that day that everybody finally sees through and sees that you have no idea what you're talking about. And I think like that's like the darker side of imposter syndrome. I do think there can be like elements of imposter syndrome that can be positively used to incorporate more skills. But when it comes to related things like limiting beliefs, everybody has limiting beliefs. It's essentially like you cannot see like the full purview of what you're capable of, where other people can kind of like take a more objective look at you. And then there's like insecurities, which I feel like you had tapped on a little bit, which is like as soon as you're in a new environment, like if you were a high school football player and then you go to college, right? Then you're like, everybody's amazing. And then if you have the good fortune to go to the pros, now all of a sudden you're in this new tier, and like even the star quarterback in college is like, shit, like I feel like the worst person in the league. And I feel like that is different than the other two things that I talked about, because that's something that usually, if you've got a growth mindset, kind of spurs you into action and spurs you to improve, to kind of like level up with your peers. That's what I've got. David, Allie, what do you think?
Go ahead. The mask thing resonates for sure. I used to think the best way to combat that was kind of a fake it till you make it mentality, which I think everyone needs to learn at some point or another. But when it perpetuates after you've quote unquote made it or have evidence of your skill, which I think all of us have hard evidence, whether it's like business results or our titles or whatever you want to call it, that's where it turns into imposter syndrome for me of like, what do I really need? Like, what kind of proof do I really need to believe that I'm not faking it anymore? Like, I'm really here. Not that I've arrived, right? You're always honing your skills. Like even in the NFL, when you're surrounded by pros, once you've reached that level, it doesn't really stop. So for me, it's like, it definitely feels like the mask. Sometimes it's not as strong. But for me, it's definitely more just a sense of insecurity. You know, if I feel like what I'm doing isn't good enough or what I'm doing doesn't have the same kind of impact every day, which is natural. Sometimes that wanes. So I guess my definition would probably align most with yours, Alex.
Yeah, same. I think building on what you said, Alex, and what you said, Allie, I think the imposter syndrome really shows up when I look side to side and I start comparing. Because there's that feeling that I'm wearing a mask and I'm figuring it out as I go, and I don't really have all the answers, but everyone else does have all the answers and knows what they're doing, which is usually false. I think that's where it comes from. Yeah. And once I realize, oh wait, they don't really know what they're doing either, I immediately feel better about myself. And I'm like, oh, we're all just in this journey of life together. And some of us are better at acting like we know what we're doing and are confident in that, and others are less confident in it. Like, I still deal with it from time to time, but less so than before, because I kind of just learned to ignore that little voice in my head. But even just asking other public company CEOs what they think of it, they're like, yeah, it doesn't go away. You just learn to ignore the voice. Like I've asked Halligan and Dharmesh that all the time, and they're like, yeah, I have it all the time before I get on stage. And I'm like, oh, wow, if you have it, I'm never going to get rid of it.
The comparison thing is huge. And that's why I think everyone's talking about it, because all of our work, everything is so public now. Yeah. And I think if your career or your job or your brand or whatever doesn't look the same as the folks that you respect and have their shit together, then there's an immediate sense of insecurity. For example, I don't have a newsletter. Sometimes I want to, sometimes I don't. Probably would be good, but I don't know if I really want to do that. And knowing that everyone else on this call has a newsletter makes me feel like I'm not very good at my job. Is it directly correlated? No. but there's elements of people's careers and the personal brands that they're building and the work that they do and their audience size and all this stuff, all very impressive. But sometimes that stuff isn't the metrics or the things that people should be looking at to then measure themselves in their role, which we could go down that path later in the conversation. But yeah, the comparison aspect is huge.
Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, I think one thing that also is not really talked about is going from behind the scenes to in front of the scenes. Do you work really deep down in optimizing all that stuff, or are you more of like a thought leader at the company? And when you switch those so suddenly, and that's kind of what happened to me, like I was very, very, very front of house at Foundation and at Bengage to fully behind the scenes of like not publishing anything for almost a year now. It really kind of messes with where you get your success metrics from.
It sometimes feels like that the people who are really embedded in doing the work tend to have the most imposter syndrome, and the people who are talking the most and maybe used to do the work 10 years ago, like they don't suffer from this. Yeah, or maybe they do, and they just get over it and still get on stage. But like, that's something I've noticed.
Yeah, I do think it's funny that some people who like built companies 10 years ago are like telling us how to market things today still. And I'm like, when was the last time you were in Google Analytics or on Ahrefs or were running a site audit?
Yeah. Do you guys still do you feel imposter syndrome when maybe like when we do podcasts like this, like Brian, when you were on the podcast, did you have any sort of those fears? Like, I shouldn't be talking about these things, or like Allie, David, when we're writing content, do you ever feel that kind of hesitation before you press publish that maybe you shouldn't be talking about this? Or
every newsletter. I'm just going to be real. Yeah. It takes me a long time to write my newsletters, and then it takes me close to an hour. I read it probably 17 times through. David knows this. The first couple of editions, I was like, can you read this for me? It was fine. And no one even emailed me back. But it's just, I think it's the same, Alex, that you said, like, I'm not used to holding the mic. That wasn't the kind of child I was. That wasn't the kind of student I was. I'm very proud to be doing it now. But when I like put so much of myself out there and I haven't quite built that muscle up like some of y'all have, it gets really, I feel like I shouldn't be doing it, basically.
That's fascinating, because I never feel that anymore. But I do remember when I was at CXL feeling like that, when I would send out a newsletter or publish a blog post, because I think there was always like, and this is more psychological, but that impending feeling that you're going to get fired the next day type of thing. Yeah. So you related to this too.
I don't feel that way about writing blog posts.
But that's what I mean, is like, we shouldn't have that fear in the fact that we run the company, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, what is the hesitation before pressing publish now?
Because it's like an original thought. It's not that my blogging isn't, but it's supposed to be raw. It's supposed to be transparent. It's supposed to represent us as founders and the company. So therefore, it's a bigger consequence if I fuck up.
It's a fear of critique, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not incredibly like prone to conflict or critique, but it's not going to kill me. So it's just, like I said, building a habit, flexing a muscle.
Well, we had talked to a friend, David and I did, who is sitting on tons of like ready to publish drafts, and he doesn't want to publish them. And it kind of came up that the fear was, well, what if these pieces are successful and they actually pick up attention and people start, poking holes in it. And then like I'm on the line and I've got these criticisms, and it's almost it's a fear of success in some ways.
I almost enjoy when I get criticism, because 98% of the time I've already thought of what they're going to try to do something. And I love sparring with someone that's like, hey, did you do this? I'm like, yeah, actually, I already did that. It's in the draft. If you actually read it, it's right there. And I'll take a screenshot and send it like that. I would love to do that at Foundation, and Ross would like reel me in, because he's a little more kill him with kindness. I'm a little more kill him with facts.
So Ryan, does critique not validate your imposter syndrome?
Not for, if it's something I don't really care that much about. Like if I just throw out a tweet, if I just throw up something on LinkedIn and they're like, this was wrong, I'm like, okay, it took me 4 seconds to think about it. I didn't really do much. I didn't put too much of myself into it, but a lot of my tear downs and some of my older content, I put so much time into it. And I think some of that time was like building out the response to like what would happen. And that's kind of my manager actually kind of talked about this in our yearly review. I'm like recreating like responses to problems that may never happen. And I think that's from just kind of covering all my bases. And sometimes you need to do that, sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
Another thing is being more comfortable being imperfect or being wrong. Because I think early in my career, I was deeply terrified that I had like the wrong take.
Yeah.
Which like now I'm like, I definitely have the wrong take. Like I know I'm wrong. When it was especially like things like experimentation where I felt like everybody was smarter than me and like had like multiple, advanced degrees and stuff. I'm like, I'm going to put out an article about like one-tailed versus two-tailed statistical tests. Like I'm probably going to be wrong here. And that fear of being shown as wrong, I think rocked my world. But now when we talk about content, when I tweet something, when I post on LinkedIn, I don't know, there's some, I don't know if it's just confidence, less insecurity, but I'm pretty okay being wrong. I mean, how many times on the podcast have we said something like, have you listened to back some of these kitchen side episodes? Sometimes I'm like, why the fuck did I say that? Like, I barely even agree with myself, but I guess I'm okay like laying my imperfections in public now. Whereas I used to be pretty afraid of that.
I think my biggest looking back on you are a giant idiot is probably like my first or second year in marketing. I'm like, oh, SEO is going to die in the next like 2 years. And now what is it, 10 years later? And we're still doing it.
Do you have that tweet somewhere, Ryan?
And now ChatGPT finally might actually kill SEO, right?
Maybe.
Ryan, I had a question for you, Ryan. You kind of mentioned this earlier. Like, one, I want to hear what it's like with that imposter syndrome at Reforge, because you're working with like world-class product leaders and engineers and all of that. How did you deal with that? If you did, because it sounds like you said at the end of what you opened with, like it seemed beneficial, which I don't think enough of us talk about how that can actually be a fuel. So we'd love to hear you share a bit more like detailed experience in that.
So when I came into, one of the reasons I chose Reforge, I had a lot of options when I left Foundation. One of the reasons I chose Reforge was to work with those super smart people. And I've learned so much about just like operations and stuff like that. I mean, most of them are like product leaders or very smart people in engineering or growth or something like that. So it's not one-to-one where I can use some of their stuff, but just the way that they think about things has helped me so much. But I think in the beginning, what was so hard was I was comparing myself to them and trying to be on their level. But what I needed to do was just be the best marketer, be the best content person I can do, because that helps them so much, because they're not content people. The stuff that they write, the stuff that they're creating, the ideas that they have are bananas sometimes and just discombobulated. And I could only do the best I could only be the best content person. And they were so grateful for that. So I don't want to say it put us on like an even playing field, but I was so happy to be working with them. They were so happy to have like a guiding editor and someone who kind of turns their ideas into a piece of content. So that really helped. But it still was kind of like, these are really smart people. Like, why are they listening to me? And I think that hurt in the beginning, but now not as much. Like I'm very confident in like giving them advice. And I think I was a little anti-controversial in the beginning because I'm like, where do I have the power to tell them that they should do X, Y, Z? But now I'm like, you have to do this because we're going for this goal. And I think having that time to kind of settle in and realize that like your role is this, it's not to be on their levels, to help them elevate a part of their brand or voice, really helped me a lot.
I love that. And it's like just knowing what your game is or what your role is, instead of trying to be the best product leader, which you're probably not going to be.
Yeah.
You're going to be the best marketer or content person, and that's going to be super beneficial. I couldn't tell if it was like an explicit conversation you had maybe with your manager or anything, but it's almost like here's my lane. I'm going to be really fucking good at this. And I know I'm good at it. And so here's where I'll focus. And I don't need to worry about being good at those other things that's their lane.
Yeah. I don't think it was ever an explicit conversation, but it was almost just like me finally clicking in my head that like that is the value I bring, and like my SEO expertise and all that stuff that I can bring to the content is what makes it better, instead of trying to be on their level of, like you said, product leaders.
Do you think so? If we say like growth is kind of predicated on a feeling of discomfort, right? If you're not uncomfortable at all, you're probably not growing. Do you think then growth requires a little bit of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think anymore you need to be uncomfortable where you are, or else you're not gonna invest in getting out of that state of discomfort. Like, I mean, I'm definitely a lot better my imposter syndrome is a lot lower than it used to be, but there's still some in the back of your head, like, this might be the worst thing you've ever done. Why are you doing this? And then I'll research it and be like, actually, this is a great idea because of X, Y, Z. So it's almost that little voice that's like, yeah, you could just stay where you are, but if you do this, it could help you grow even more.
I think then the feeling of discomfort is actually not the thing that's negative. Like, I think that's universal.
Yeah.
All of us have it to some extent. Imposter syndrome becomes poisonous when it prevents you from jumping into that situation where you would grow in the first place.
Yes, very good call. I like that.
Because there's pain in both of those areas, right? Like the pain of like being in that uncomfortable situation, I think that's palpable and everybody understands it. But the pain of realizing that you could have been more than you are, like, you have better potential and you're in this comfort zone, that's also painful.
Yeah. So what really helped me, and I think about it probably daily now, is one of our EIRs, which is executives in residence. They help build out our courses and stuff like that. I worked on a piece of content with her, and she said when she was at, I think, DraftKings or one of the early like betting companies, that she didn't raise her hand when a new like opportunity came up, and she regretted it so much. But then when she regretted it so much that the next time something else popped up, she raised her hand and got like 3 other opportunities just because of that. And just by raising her hand, she didn't think she was ready in the beginning. And I think she said that she didn't really level up that much going into the next couple opportunities, but just being able to like raise your hand and be like, yeah, I want to take this on, helped her accelerate so quickly. So I think just being open to raise your hand on those things that you're uncomfortable about.
Yeah. Like more.
I want to touch on that actually, because I randomly stumbled on this interview question today, like a job interview question. And David and Allie, I wanted to tell you about it because I think it's cool. But there's never a situation where you're 100% certain. Like the 100% certainty doesn't exist. So the question that I phrased was, we were talking about like career goals and like kind of like, when do you think you're ready for that, like that end goal, like where you want to reach? And the question was, what percentage ready do you need to be in order to jump into a new role or uncertain situation, or what percentage is ideal? I think that question is pretty interesting because it kind of tells you, it's like, if the person says 95% certain, like they're probably pretty affected by imposter syndrome. And now if they say like 10%, like maybe they should do a little more research before they jump into those uncertain situations. But like, I feel like that scale predicts a lot in terms of like how much imposter syndrome is going to either prevent success for you or whether you can deal with the uncertainty and kind of fight through it. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Well, in the context of the interview, we were talking about like people management and leadership. And that was one of those things in the past where I would have said like, I needed to be like 80% certain. I needed training. Like I needed to figure out how to do one-on-ones and all this stuff. And then now that we're leaders, I realize, I hope the team's not listening. It's like, we don't actually know most of what we're doing, right?
Nobody knows
we're kind of figuring
doing
it out as we go. So my percentage threshold dropped a lot, especially as we like jumped into doing the agency full time. Entrepreneurship is constantly finding the biggest problem in front of you that you don't know how to solve, figuring out how to solve it, and then moving on to the next problem. So you're pretty much always in imposter syndrome mode because you've never solved the problem that you're currently solving. So now my threshold is very low. I would say it's, in 20 to 40% range. I think the percentage it's different in different scenarios. You know, like we're not making life and death decisions. I think if you're going to operate on somebody as a surgeon, like you should be pretty confident that you have the skills to do that. So I don't know.
I feel like being certain and being ready are two different things. You can be certain that something's good for you that would be beneficial for your career and would be scary, but you know you should do it. And then the process of being ready for that is probably maybe step 2. Maybe it's more tangible readiness or mental readiness. So that's what struck me with the way that you explained it, because there's plenty of things I'm like, I should do that. And it's taken me a while to get there. I sat on this idea to do an improv class for close to a year. And last week I finally signed up.
Nice.
So I'm doing improv at second
Those are
city.
terrifying.
It took me a long time to be ready, but the minute I saw the class, I knew for certain that I wanted to do it. So I wonder how folks like manage that like 2-part process, or if someone is certain that they should or want to do something, they're immediately ready. I feel like that's just how different people operate. But yeah, going back on what you said about leadership, I told David once, I feel like leadership and running a business are like repeated exposure therapy.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
There's like straight therapy. Once you get used to something, it's like on to the next. And it's just
like in public, in front of everyone too. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, David, here, let's do a concrete one, because you a while back had started as a head of growth, which you hadn't done before, right? You came from HubSpot and had some of the experience, but there was like multiple different layers and different tasks and leadership as well. Like, what percentage ready did you feel you were for that when you kicked that off? I'm sure it wasn't 100%.
Well, this is probably where I can relate to Ryan the most. Like, those product leaders that you were working with were the same ones I was comparing myself to. I mean, at HubSpot, I was in the weeds doing the work and I knew my shit. But once I got that title head of growth, all of a sudden I felt like, oh, stakes are higher. I gotta look a certain way and act a certain way and speak a certain way. And then I realized, oh wait, the VPs I'm like peers with are also figuring things out as they go. So that helped significantly. But I was definitely in my head a lot about what it means to be a head of growth. And it helped to reach out to other people who were heads of growth or ex-heads of growth and them kind of validate my feelings. Like, yeah, it's kind of lonely. No one really understands what you do. You kind of have to explain yourself to everyone. I'm like, great, I'm not crazy. I do know my shit. It's just that other people are speaking a different language than me. But that was probably the biggest point of imposter syndrome for me. And the way I got through that was, honestly, I talked to my manager about it. And I was just like, look, it feels a little bit weird. We talked about this during the hiring process too. Like, I haven't been in a head of or VP role before. I'm going to need your coaching and all that. And he was super supportive, which was helpful. But I guess that leads to a question I had was, who is responsible for helping a person get through imposter syndrome? Is it like hey, go to therapy and figure it out on your own, or like talk to your manager, or like?
I think you need to take ownership, because what you just said there is very interesting. You were transparent and honest and weren't hiding any imperfections. You know, you weren't saying like, oh yeah, I've got all this experience and like, I know how to do this and that. You were upfront. And I think like the individual has to take responsibility for that. And then there's this whole other side, which is like the corporate culture that surrounds you and makes failure and honesty and all of those things safe. It's like safe cultures, right? But like at the start, you didn't try to polish yourself into like the perfect candidate. No. You were like, here's all of the imperfections I have. I think you have to be upfront. That's very important.
Did you know what to ask for help?
No,
or what you needed?
I just said I'm going to need coaching. I don't know what I don't know. Like, I'm going to observe and learn from observing as much as I can, but there's going to be frameworks that, like, my manager came from leading 1,000-person orgs at Cisco and like other companies. He's been in tech for decades. So he had that experience that I didn't have. And I learned a ton, like both directly and indirectly. So I think maybe it helped that I took it upon myself. But what about, like, let's say, Ryan, I don't know if you manage a team, but let's say you observe that a team member or a peer is struggling with like raising their hand or not taking on opportunities or feeling like they're not ready. How do you help that person? Or is it something they have to come to on their own? One example I've had is like with my girl. It happens with like a lot of my female friends, but like they're like, I don't know if I'm ready. I'm like, do you feel like you aren't ready, or like are you actually not ready or not qualified? Because I think you're qualified, and that usually stumps them because I don't think anyone's been explicit, and I just like being straightforward. And usually they end up applying for whatever role, but like, how do you kind of have that conversation?
That's a tough one. I just from my mindset, but I ran into the same thing with my female friends, my sister, my girlfriend, of just like not feeling like they're ready and or qualified. I'm like, do it. Why not? What's the worst that can happen? And I think as I've been listening to you guys talk, I think my mindset is so over the past years, what's the worst that can happen? Like, what's the worst that can happen of you doing this, or you raising your hand, or you applying, or you whatever? And 90% of the time, it's like nothing's going to happen. Like nothing changes in your life because you raised your hand or something like that, or nothing negative happens. But when it comes to like subordinates or like new people on the team, like I did a lot of coaching at Vengage just for like new writers, and same at Foundation. And just like, I think it kind of falls a little bit on them unless you explicitly can see that they're struggling. Like if they're like, oh, I don't want to do that, I don't feel qualified, then you might have to hype them up. You might have to get them excited. You might be, here's where you start. Here's a framework you can use. But if they're just like chugging along, just acting normal, I think it's really hard to see the imposter syndrome, because I think even when I was talking to my manager, I don't think anyone knew that I was feeling super out of place until I brought it up. Just because you were executing so much, you're getting things done, you're working really hard, you're doing all these things. Like my first like review I had, it was just like positives all around, and I'm like, I still don't believe that. I feel like you're lying to me.
Yeah. Are you fucking
nice?
Yeah.
I had that at HubSpot too. Yeah. It was like overtly positive for the first couple. I'm like, are you serious? Like,
Yeah.
nothing?
Like I'm terrible.
Yeah. I actually don't like that though. I think like it depends on like your goals and your personality, but I do think that managers who kind of coddle you, I'm not saying that happened to you, Ryan, but like at HubSpot, it was definitely a little bit more soft and coddled, coming from my experience with CXL and Pep. You know, he's got high standards. But in retrospect, I actually think, and I tweeted about this today, the kindest thing you can do for somebody is like believe in them so much, believe in them more than they believe in themselves, and hold them to those standards. Right. Yeah. In retrospect, that was incredibly kind. It didn't feel like it at the time, but it was kinder than softening the blow and giving me like all positive feedback and like holding me to lower expectations than I had, frankly, for myself.
Yeah.
It's almost like tough love, but like in a work setting.
Yep.
Like you wouldn't use the same phrase, but it's definitely more, that to me shows more respect than just blanket positive general feedback.
Yeah. And it can border on toxic too, if it's all in the favor of that manager who's trying to squeeze work out of you. And like, especially, you know, if they're instilling a culture of fear. But I feel like if you can hold those high standards and give the person the respect and like, you know, believe in their capabilities while simultaneously making it like the safe environment to fail and be imperfect and like have multiple shots on goal. Because I've definitely been in environments where, you know, it's not cool to be wrong. It's like it's like looked down upon. And I think those cultures are ripe for real imposter syndrome that gets in people's ways. But I think if you can balance those two things, like the high expectations and holding people to how you believe in them, and then making it okay to be imperfect and to fail, like that's a good recipe for a culture.
Yeah. My current manager, which you guys probably know, Autumn, she has done a lot of that. And it's really helped me hold me to very high standards because she knows what I can do, but also not be toxic about it, which I've ran into in the past where it's like, you can do all this. Why aren't you doing it? It's more like, I know you can do all of this. Here's some tools to help you get even further, or come to me if you have a question on what you want to do. And sometimes it's just been like, in previous companies, it's just been like, do this. And that's all they tell you. They're like, figure it out. And it's good for sometimes, but when you're like, I need a little more information, they're like, just figure it out. You're like, but what does that mean?
Do you feel like her talking about her imposter syndrome made it easier for you to share yours?
On them or just in general? I don't know if I don't know if we explicitly talked about like imposter syndrome, but I think,
or I guess her being transparent about things she's maybe not 100% comfortable.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm friends with a lot of my coworkers, and that's just because I, one, care about them and want them to succeed, and two, just like I found it so much easier to work with them when people are being extra transparent about things, because you can tell when like something's serious or important with those people, and you can push back on it. And yeah, just being more open about everything, and kind of modeling those behaviors. Autumn has been great about that over the past couple months. Just like, come to me if you have a problem, if you have any questions, if you have that. And it helps kind of you connect with them outside of just like the day-to-day stuff. And also you can come to them when you're like, I have no idea what to do. And they're like, oh, start here. And you're like, perfect.
Yeah. Considering that a lot of imposter syndrome outside of just a healthy dose of humility, considering that is created a lot from comparison, I wonder if more transparency would help folks not feel it as much.
1,000%.
You know what that looks like at scale. I know a lot of people are like Twitter transparent, but I just wonder if real conversation would help. Because I know hearing that you all have it helps me. Sometimes I don't know. It's part of it's just like the loneliness of it.
Yeah.
I just realized, Ryan, you have the same reporting chain that I had at HubSpot. I reported to Anam, and Brian Balfour was my VP.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
So just throwing that out there.
That's actually amazing.
That's cool.
So funny. And Peachy's my boss now too.
So really?
It's basically just like a HubSpot.
He was also my boss at one point. Yeah. But what I love about this conversation is there's kind of takeaways for both managers and like team members. Like for managers, like, hey, hype up your team, set high bars for them, and like support them rather than just leave them to drown on their own. And then for team members, like have the conversation if you're feeling that way, so that you can get the support you need, or at least like talk it out and either be given the resources or be validated, like, hey, you're actually doing a really damn good job. Like, I don't like, let's talk about why you're feeling this way. Because I think what I found is once I talked about those things, like it felt like my growth skyrocketed, because then it felt more comfortable. Like, okay, it's everyone knows I'm not going to know everything in terms of like how to act in this certain role, but my manager knows that, and he's going to keep an eye out for like feedback to give and things like that. So I'm going to make mistakes, not expect it to be perfect. Yeah. And now I'm just going to grow much faster because I don't need to like hide away or anything.
Dude, this is like Brene Brown's Power of Vulnerability in a nutshell. And it's crazy how like as soon as you're open about that stuff, like, I mean, David, we have like our accountability calls and we'll talk about stuff like this all the time. And then everyone else chimes in. It's like, oh, we've all felt this before. And it's like, you know, as soon as you like open that up, you're like, oh shit, I'm not the only one. It's crazy, but it's, you know, vulnerability basically.
I kind of want to double click on that, on how David said that you were hiding, because I felt like that, like my first like 3 months at Reforge, for a lot of the imposter syndrome reasons we talked about earlier. Just like I'm around all these smart people, they don't want to hear from me. And I just was, I don't know if I was afraid, but I just would kind of keep things to myself and like try to figure them out. But now I'm like shooting off Slack messages like it's going out of style, and I'll shoot something to Pete or I'll shoot something to Autumn and just be like, hey, have this idea, blah, blah, blah. Let's try this XYZ. And before that, I'd be like, do they even care about this? Do they even want to hear from me? And kind of having that turning point of not being afraid to speak on your expertise to people outside of your kind of immediate team really helped me. Because I was hiding. I was like,
I used to be so afraid to waste people's time like that. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like a key thing that helped me was my manager. He was the chief product officer. He was like, hey, by month 1, I want you presenting at all hands and like presenting at all executive staff. And I'm like, wait, I just joined. He's like, yeah, but you're the expert. They don't know this stuff. You need to educate. I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure I'm ready? He's like, yeah, I know you're ready. Like, we'll practice. I'm like, okay, man, you got all this faith in me for a reason, I guess. And that I think that's a really good example of maybe how managers can like give their team members the stage to like encourage them, and like you'll be there to support. But I feel like that's one of the things I try to mirror. Like, don't try to fill in for them. Like, just let them speak for themselves, and they'll shine and get the confidence from doing that.
Yeah. One big thing that we did over the last 6 months is we completely rebranded and relaunched our website, and Autumn giving me the reins to do a lot of the recommendations on the site architecture, on how we do all of these things, and just honestly default to me with any of those questions on SEO was like such a powerful supercharge to like my day-to-day work, because now I'm like, oh, they actually give a shit about what I'm saying. And she's presenting this to Belfour and all like the very smart people. So yeah, just giving them opportunities to really shine, I think, in a controlled environment really helps.
There was a question that David, you put on the talking points. It's kind of contrary to what we were just talking about, so I want to bring it up. You pointed out, might talking about imposter syndrome make it worse? What did you mean there?
Yeah, I have trouble trying to phrase this correctly. So if it comes out incorrectly, please forgive me. But I wonder if pointing out some of these things, like what if someone didn't have imposter syndrome, but everyone's talking about it and asking if they have it, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, do I have it? And then they start questioning themselves. Yeah. And I mean, this is going to be a completely unrelated analogy, but I remember, and I'll tie it back. Like, I remember like a lot of the Stop Asian Hate stuff happened. I was like, wait, should I feel unsafe? Like, is there like microaggressions happening? I'm not aware. I'm like, no, I'm good. Like, it's just everyone's talking about it, so now I'm looking for it. So for imposter syndrome, I wonder if some people like, maybe they're better off not thinking about it because they're like trying their best and not worried about faking it. But if people talk about imposter syndrome so much that this person starts questioning themselves, like, could it be an adverse effect? I don't know. That was a thought that came to mind, because there was a point when like everyone was talking about it. I'm like, wait,
that's interesting.
Spurring some people to.
I want to take that in a different direction too, and say that it's safe to say you have imposter syndrome, in that it's like a self-deprecating thing. So it kind of pads whatever you're going to do in the idea that you are an expert, but you don't feel like one. So I think it's really safe to say you have imposter syndrome. And to the contrary, if you don't, like, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're the imposter? Because I felt that a couple times too. Like, when I am confident about something, I'm like, am I like Dunning-Kruger? Like, actually like the thought leader who doesn't know what the fuck you're talking about? Because I do think like everybody seems to have it, and if everybody has a syndrome, like, it's not really a syndrome, right? So I don't know.
Well, we were talking earlier about like the being certain and being ready and welcoming a sense of discomfort when it comes to growth and change. And I think imposter syndrome has become this like blanket term for a lot of that. And it's super valid, but I think it only becomes imposter syndrome when it just continues to fester and perpetuate, and you don't have help, or maybe you don't feel safe, or maybe you just don't ask for help. I think like a percentage of that discomfort is probably just humility and just knowing that you don't know things, and welcoming the sensation of not being the smartest person in the room. Like the same analogy you used, Alex, from going from like high school to college to NFL, like you could push through all of that and know it's going to be uncomfortable. And maybe for, I don't know, 6 months or your first game, like it's really scary, but over time you kind of let that go. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it's like to not have that feeling of imposter syndrome. I feel like there's probably folks out there who maybe should have it, or like a small dose of it.
Well, I wonder why we have it so much in tech though, because it's like the psychology of this in fields like medicine is insane. Like if you talk to people, who are going through like residency or something like that, the hours that they're working and like the amount of like intelligence in the room, but they don't seem to have imposter syndrome the same way that somebody who like sends like email marketing messages does. So I don't really understand that.
Saving lives.
Right.
Well,
if they fuck up, like they kill someone,
I feel like other industries like that, there's a lot of tangibility to it. there's a lot of camaraderie to it because you're around other people a lot of times in person. Our industry is now very remote. And I think there's a lot of like, I don't want to say the word approval, but like you kind of have an immediate return on your actions, whether it's through literally saving a life or a grade on a paper or feedback from a doctor. You have a lot more like evidence of your work, of your knowledge. And I think with our industry, we're separated, we're remote, we're async, don't always have the results. Sometimes it's a waiting game, and sometimes it's very nebulous what we're working on.
Yeah. I think I to build off of that, I think that I really like your point about it's in person, because I think we get this little teeny smidge of an insight into everyone's life. And if they're talking constantly about, look at this awesome campaign I wrote or ran, or look at this awesome blog post I did, all those things, you're just like, well, shit, look at all these things they're doing. But they're also not going to bed early. They're also not working out. They're also not doing all these different things that they could be spending that time for, that maybe you or me or whoever's doing, and trading that off. So I think it's really hard when you only get, it's just the same social media thing where you get that tiny little image of someone, and we're chronically online. So we get a lot of that kind of.
Everybody calls social media the highlight reel. And even if it's professionally related, it's still just the highlights.
Yeah. I want to see someone post.
Yeah. Failure.
Misspelled. But one analogy I've been kind of playing with in my head is like marketers are like planting seeds that they're gonna harvest in 6 months, and it's really, really hard to know anything until that seed starts to sprout a couple weeks. So you're just like, well, shit, am I good at any of this? I won't know for another 6 months. And that really messes with your brain sometimes. You're like, oh, I've just worked so hard on this. No results for a month. And then you're like, oh, wait, it actually did good. And then you just continually are doing that. It's not like you can like savor that good thing that you did. You're like, oh, on to the next one.
Yeah, that is interesting. The delayed feedback window of some of the stuff we do.
Yeah.
I have a tough question if we have time here. This is, I guess, similar. I read an article when I was kind of researching imposter syndrome and what people think about it from HBR. It was about women and saying, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. So essentially, they framed it as sort of putting the blame on the individual when there's actual structural barriers to succeeding in certain organizations. So could imposter syndrome also be weaponized to say like, hey, it's your fault, right? Like if you just had more confidence and if you just raised your hand more, like you would have the opportunities. Do you think it could be also sort of weaponized culturally like that? This is something I haven't thought much about. So
I think with job postings, it can be weaponized when they're like, you need 10 years of whatever. And they get really, but I did see a really interesting job post a couple weeks ago where it was like, it had like 2 or 3 paragraphs of like, statistically, women and minorities are less likely to apply to jobs because of XYZ, because of the qualifications that are listed on here. So even if you don't have those, please apply to us. I know that's just lip service, but it is pointing out the problem that I think a lot of these job postings have. And that's how you get in the door, is through a post like that. So if you're really, really like, I don't know if I exactly meet those qualifications, I'm not going to apply.
Yeah, it is tough because at the end of the day, like you do have to like raise your hand eventually, right? You know, you can definitely be in cultures where, like we were talking about before, you have a manager who helps you like push you in the deep end or like put you on center stage. But to get in that room, you also probably have to take a risk and not be 100% certain. So, yeah, it's a strange concept. Ryan, you brought us into this very deep conversation. This is awesome.
Yeah, I love stuff like this. I was talking about a marketing campaign earlier today, and I just wasn't in it. I was explaining it. I'm like, I can't wait to talk about this imposter syndrome stuff later today.
That's funny.
What else? Do we have anything, final thoughts on imposter syndrome? One thing I'll say is I do wish people working in the field, like getting their hands dirty every day. I do wish they would talk and write more. And I don't know if that's just purely a function of time, but I do sense a lot of like lack of confidence. I don't believe that what I have to say is important. And I wish more of those insights were out into the world as opposed to just like thought leader Twitter thread shit.
Yeah. That external validation could help with internal. So external, as I'm saying, stuff that you do outside of your daily job is almost like an antidote to internal company driven imposter syndrome. Because I've used that in the past to kind of like, oh, I don't feel great in this position. Let me do all these other things that kind of validate me as an expert in the field.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I like your question, Ryan, that you put at the end. Where has imposter syndrome impacted you outside of your job? What came to mind when you wrote that?
Everything. I mean, just like weightlifting, like I was so fine with just doing everyday workouts. And then once I finally got on like a legit weight training program after like multiple years of just being like, I'm not one of those lifters. And I'm just like seeing so much progress from just taking that risk. But I'm like, I'm not that kind of person. And same with woodworking. I just started doing that over the last couple of months. And I was like, I don't know enough. I don't want to dive in. There's so many people. And then you see on Pinterest or whatever, of all these amazing things that people are building. I'm like, I don't even know where to start. And then I was just like, well, shit, I got to start somewhere. And I was building plant stands and all this stuff. And it's just, I think anything that you start, and even with your improv class that you were talking about, it kind of brought to my mind of like, sometimes you just have to jump in the deep end and kind of figure it out.
Yeah, I was telling my husband, like, I'm not good at being bad at things. I think it's a byproduct of having been a good student. And I also was a part of so many hobbies and things when I was a kid, but your brain is so much more malleable when you're young. So you really can't expect to have the same speed of learning things, but you have to be bad at shit before you become good at it. So I wonder if that's an element of imposter syndrome too, entering a new job with really impressive leaders, or entering a new industry or something where you're like, I'm going to be bad at this for a little bit and that's okay. And then learning how to ask for help, leaning on other people. But yeah, it's just a prerequisite, I think, to that growth.
I wonder if there's something that companies could be better about of like, I think everything is so fast paced and onboarding is so like, at least onboarding that I've been in, it's so like, check this box, do this thing, do that. If there is more safe space building, like we don't expect you for the first 3 months to do anything massive other than like understand what your job is supposed to look like.
Yeah, I remember when I was being onboarded at Shopify, I was part of a very autonomous team, which was welcome. Like I wanted to do that, but by nature we were kind of left to our own devices. And I was really afraid to tell my boss Khim that like I didn't know what to do. Like I had some ideas, but I didn't really know how to put my tactics to work or test them or validate them. And I didn't have any coworkers really. We all had our own streams. And it took me a couple months to like work up the courage to talk about that. So if there is stuff built into onboarding, that's not just like run through this module or like take this demo. It's like more intentional to like create and foster that.
Yeah.
Safe place.
I have two examples there. And one of them is probably like not a lot of people would advise this, but when I was at HubSpot, you go through, this like 3 or 4 week training program on the product and like inbound marketing. And if you've been in marketing, like, all of this stuff. So my manager, Towsley, was like, hey, you're just going to like start doing your work, and like, I think like 4 or 5 days in, like I was, on like customer interviews and stuff like that. And the trainers were not happy about it because they're like, oh, he has to go through product training. But I was like, this is sick. Like I'm actually in the job. Yeah. And like, it was like not making me like wait long enough. Like it wasn't like anything that I was going to like fail drastically at, putting me out in that arena. And the other thing that I thought was cool was at Workato, I try to do this here at Omniscient because I think like fresh eyes have like interesting ideas, angles, and like there's so many things that we just like set up a while ago and we haven't thought about since, or like, could be improved, but we're too close to the problem. So I try to like invoke like ideas from people who first joined the company. But at Workato, like there was, 700 employees, and like everybody in the training class got to talk with the CEO. and just like do a roundtable and like pitch a bunch of ideas and improvements for the onboarding process and just generally like cultural things. And it was cool just interacting with him because it was very like open and transparent. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. I put this on the doc, and it's something that was sticking in my brain because I've been at so many different types of companies. It's like, do you think imposter syndrome, and this is kind of a two-part question, is more detrimental or more prevalent at like venture versus self-funded companies, big versus small, or is it just like more based on your team than anything and your expertise?
I between HubSpot and Shopify, I joined this like really tiny startup. I was I was the second marketer, only content person. I didn't really feel it because I didn't really have anybody to compare myself to.
Yeah.
Now I wasn't working with like ex-Uber folks. But I remember feeling a little bit more freedom. And my boss was also like super human. Like he was very real from day one, which was awesome. Because I could be transparent about a lot of things I was unsure about. So I've felt it more at bigger companies because there's a lot more folks like you're working shoulder to shoulder with, folks that have come before you, the programs they've run. There's a lot more opportunity for comparison, which is my personal like imposter syndrome trigger.
Same.
Mm-hmm. I felt it way more at CXL. I didn't feel it at all at HubSpot, at all at Workato. No, it wasn't because of Pep. It was because of the exposure to my personal writing and vulnerabilities. It was because I had to put my thoughts out all the time, and like it was very bare. Like I felt at HubSpot, like I could just kind of hide in this machine. And honestly, if I stopped doing my work, went on vacation, like it didn't matter. You know, you could probably fire 20 to 50% of any large public tech company, and it wouldn't make a huge difference. Whereas like I felt like at CXL, one, it was early in my career, so I was a lot more insecure. It was a technical space, and we were working like with Reforge, like with top people in experimentation and analytics. And I was supposed to like showcase my knowledge alongside them. That was the only time I felt it to that extreme level.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I think, and it's nothing that Reforge has done. It's none of my managers, but just I joined right after we raised a big Series B. And I think that also kind of messed with my head a little bit. And just knowing that Belfour was the expert in growth and all these people, even before I met them, I'm like, oh my God, these guys are way too smart for me. And now I found out they're like the nicest people ever and are more than willing to like work with you and kind of have a very human connection. So that
was my experience too, is by the way, the experience itself would trigger the imposter syndrome, but all the people, including Pep and the scaffolding, pushed me to get through it. Like that was the best part about it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Like I think it'll be part in my brain of my career forever. Just kind of that little voice of like, are you sure? Are you sure you should do this? What are you doing? Yeah.
That probably means you're on the right path. David and I talk about this saying all the time, faith, not fear.
Yeah.
Because there's two parts to it. The first one being that fear is a valid source of information. And if you didn't feel the fear, it probably didn't matter to you in the first place. You know, that's a function that to me is effective in all areas of life. But then it's having faith despite that you can get through it.
Yeah.
So I hope I always feel a little discomfort.
Same. Yeah. When I don't, I'm like, what is happening? But
all right. Great combo.
yeah, for sure.